Welcome to Psychosynthesis Conversations, your channel for psychospiritual reflections and experiences. And now, to introduce you to our topic for today, here is your host, Kenneth Sorensen.
Today I had the great joy of speaking with Karen Rawdon. She is a psychosynthesis psychotherapist with a busy private practice in Northamptonshire, England. She holds an MA in psychosynthesis psychology and was trained at the Institute of Psychosynthesis in London. She recently joined the faculty as a studies advisor for psychotherapy students nearing qualification. She was serving as a board member of the European Psychosynthesis Association between 2021 and 2023. Besides her work with all kinds of clients with different challenges, she specializes in working with those who suspect or know they have ADHD or ASD, whether the diagnosis came as a child or in later life, and especially supports those who aren't sure if they should seek a diagnosis or not. She truly believes that developing a trauma-informed inner life supports the transformation of relationships, self-worth, and readiness for the future that awaits. Please like and subscribe to this channel if you enjoy the content. It helps me to spread the word about psychosynthesis. I hope you will enjoy the good conversation with Karen Rawdon. Much love, Kenneth. Hi, Karen.
Hi, Ken.
Hi, and welcome to Psychosynthesis Conversation. I'm so happy to have you on. I know you from the EPA, the European Psychosynthesis Association, where you have done some webinars and you have been very active for a couple of years, as far as I understood. And you are very engaged within the psychosynthesis community, work as a psychosynthesis practitioner, therapist. And I'm so happy to bring you on board because I think that you are an important voice for the topic that we are going into today. And you have a lifelong interest in personal and spiritual development. So I would like to open this conversation up by just asking you about your psychosynthesis journey. How did you come into psychosynthesis? What's your story?
It's a great beginning, isn't it? I don't think there ever wasn't a beginning, actually. I remember being in the training in 2016. I entered into the Institute of Psychosynthesis, and on the open day, I remember having a real awareness of, oh my gosh, everything in my life has led up to this moment. And as a child, so I was born in America and brought up in England. I'm dual national, and spirituality was a huge part of my childhood. I was a Sunday school teacher when I was younger, in my teens.
Okay, yes.
And I really loved psychology and trained, did it at school, but it felt very dry for me. It felt the way that it was taught, and I liked spirituality, but I also felt that it missed that kind of weightiness of kind of being in the world. And I really, for me, I was always looking for that mix, never realizing that it could happen. And in 2002, I had cancer. I had bone cancer in my pelvis that had been growing since my teens. And, it really helped to crystallize kind of what was important for me.
Yeah.
And that brush with death and mortality, and seeing a different experience of kind of almost that the unknown and the finite and the infinite. And as a result, I kind of went into a real crisis of meaning and ended up at a place called Esalen.
Oh yes, I know Esalen.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
And I had no idea until I sat in that open day that Roberto Assagioli had spent some time there and developed some of his models there. And I'd always described Esalen as my spiritual home because I really came to land there, and a very painful journey, but a real moment of beginning, a new beginning for me. And so then I went into the training after doing lots of other things.
Yeah.
My degree was my postgrad, my undergrad was in fashion design.
Mm.
And I really, actually, when I was at school, really wanted to work with children with what we called behavioral issues back then, and really disruptive. I was often paired in my teens and late teens with children that really struggled, and worked alongside, often young boys and who were really struggling, and actually found that there was real change in them, just actually in that relationship, in that kind of side by sideness
Yeah.
of me and them. So yeah, and so it felt really important to come back and actually to restart something that had already been unfolding within me, to work in this way. And lo and behold, I don't work with children, I work with adults, but I'm always working with the children with it, and that's a huge part of my work. And yeah, so
Was there any kind of awakening moment where you can say that this was a turning point for me? Then I heard a calling, or I just knew that this was what I was going to do for a long time. Was it more a gradual unfolding?
no, I think when self calls, and I'm not doing the thing that really is in line with inner values that perhaps I didn't even know, then life gets really difficult. It
Yeah.
feels very uncomfortable. And so that was always there, actually,
Yeah.
from a really, really young age. But there were particular elements of I think having cancer, going through a divorce, really helped to call me to really review and to realign and to really explore kind of what it
Yeah.
meant to be connected with myself in the world.
So it was some sort of your cancer was some kind of existential crisis because you're faced with death. Many people experience, that as a turning point where they really have to, as you said, focus on what's the most important in my life.
Yeah.
So some people like to think of awakening as, there's just coming all this light and love and beauty into my personality. But much more often, that's my experience. It's just through pure suffering that we are, in some way, we are forced to reckon that there's more in life than just living outward life, that we have to connect with a deeper source within and prioritize our values and needs. And it seems like this was the kind of process that you were going into, or what?
Hugely. I was just thinking about that suffering, and actually, yes, the awakening process. I really, really love Assagioli's model of awakening and those stages of awakening, and it's a really great way of really tracking and helping people to really see where they are by tracking. Kind of, oh, I'm here, and they, it's not the end of the story.
Yeah.
So I believe that we have, crisis of meaning and that process of awakening happening every single moment of the day, every time we call to check in with ourselves, to go, and now what? And through there have been some very dark times in my life, and in particular times I remember having this awareness that this is the best of times and the worst of times.
Yeah.
Because it calls me to be something more, and it has not been pretty.
No.
I remember, when we talk about peak experiences, I'm like, oh my gosh, my peak experiences have been really calm in a way. They haven't been like, whoa, and they have been dark because they've really, it's like, it's amazing what light shines in that darkness.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And
Was there anything in psychosynthesis that particularly helped you through these situations?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Just one.
Yeah.
For me, psychosynthesis is personally, I think it's a fantastic foundation on which to build that connection with self. I really do. The experience of disidentification is when it's first felt, consciously with, and it is unbelievably, I don't even have the words for it. Let me find the words. It's expansive. Expansive, because to be in, and yet I think that was that really first psychosynthesis experience of the power of Assagioli's work, and the way that he articulated it, and the way that, and I'll describe it in a moment, and the way that it makes it very accessible to one's eye, and to make that very conscious is very powerful. So for me, I remember being in a situation that one moment I was caught in it, and the world was closing in, and the pain was immense, and it was an emotional pain because I had been very, very triggered, really evoked early traumatic wounding, and then something shifted, and suddenly it had come to Assagioli talks about we have to identify to disidentify. So it really came to that, that peak of pain, and then suddenly something happened, and there became a space around me, and so I was still with the pain very much, but I wasn't consumed by it. And from that space, there was like also that knowing it's like being in that dream, when we dream and we suddenly realize I'm dreaming, that actually it's like, oh, okay, I'm not going to implode. I can be with this. I can tolerate this. It's,
Yeah.
And that for me was so incredibly powerful.
So there is some kind of, it's liberating, and you use the word expansive. What could you put a few more words upon it? How do you experience this expansiveness?
How do I experience the expansiveness? And just allowing it just to sit with me for a minute, because it's too easy just to kind of talk it through. And we don't have enough words. It just gets calm. There's a stillness. For me, Ken, there's a real sense of when I become aware of my limitations. I'm here in this moment, and this is what's happening. And when I'm aware of that, then the process is to kind of move through, and it's not an intellectual, it's really a soulful moving. It's that journey of the soul. It's like allowing myself to surrender, but also be very grounded. It's the heaviness. And it's also that feeling like once I'm aware of that limitation, I am here. Then I can begin to give permission to myself to be here, give permission to my, everything seems to calm down. My sub-personalities, they're like, ooh. And and there's expansiveness from that, the chatter, the intensity.
Yeah.
And as soon as I begin to honor that, there's freedom.
Yeah.
There's freedom.
I think you're pointing to something that is very, very important. In the introduction to the Psychosynthesis Manual of Assagioli, he speaks about the experience of the self, that we can have a direct experience of the self, and it's separated from any life circumstances or content of the experience. So there is a particular experience of the self that he is pointing to, and this is exactly what it is. It is the silence, the calm, the permanency of the I. There's something in us that never changes. There's something in us that can always be present to whatever is active in our personality. And finding this place is also, in my experience, very expansive, because instead of having all the content, the pain up in your face, where you are totally identified with it, you create a gap where you can breathe and where you can have a direct experience that this is not all of you. You know, you have this calm place, even in the midst of pain and misery and suffering. And I think pointing to this place that is every person's heritage, you know, this is part of anyone, but, you know, having someone to pointing it out and finding this space within is for me the first step of liberation, you know, because you know who you are, and you know you are the witness, you are the observer, you are the one that is present to what is going on. And this creates a liberating moment. It does not solve the problem. There's still a lot of work doing, you know, in containing and loving and transforming all this content that we are influenced by.
And that's very, very key, actually, because I think it's really important that, what do I say, we can have all the awareness in the world, but unless we're able to then go, okay, now what?
Yeah, exactly.
You know? And it is that, you know, creating that space to go, okay, now what for me? Some of the work, you know, as we're talking, I'm thinking about a work that I do sometimes with my clients, whereby they have that experience of being very consumed. And I talk about magic hands and, you know, what would it be like just to imagine that we've got a force field around, and just how close is it at the moment, and just push away. And what does that feel like? That they've got power in their hands to be able to create spaciousness. They're really working with that body, and we do a lot of work. We do it together, and that in itself, visualizing, oh, I have power to push away, whether it's the outside world, whether it's the internalized power, pressure, you know, pain, and to be able to then at least be able to see it a bit more clearly. So it's evoking that will also to go, what feels the right space, what feels the right distance,
and now you're pointing to another very essential aspect of the self, the will. You say evoking that will, you know, the will to create space, because it actually takes an act of will to create that space, and of course the fundamental thing is to be aware, but you know, you also, and it's not always that we are willing to create that space, because if I'm identified with being a victim, that can be some consolation, or that can be some benefits of being the victims, until I understand, wow, now I'm just driven by this birth this child trauma. Now I have to stop it. And so sometimes we really have to take charge and step in as some kind of an authority and say, okay, no more of these games. I have to be aware of what's going on, because it's not only hurting me, it's also hurting my surroundings if I'm just identified with impulsive behavior.
Yes. Look what you were just doing with your hand. Before you were doing this, you were going, if I can say, all right, stop right there.
Yeah, exactly. I think you have already pointed now to perhaps the most fundamental, essential aspect of psychosynthesis, being a server and connecting with the will. And are there any particular type of trauma or that you have been invested in, dive into? I know you have done an MA, and where the key subject was ADHD.
ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which clinicians and people with ADHD, many agree this is an evolving name. It's changed a lot over the years.
Okay.
And it'd be interesting to see where it goes next, because it doesn't quite articulate really the lived experience.
And I think it's very exciting that people within the psychosynthesis context, take up these kind of problems that is so widespread, and show what can a psychosynthesis practitioner do in that field, because I mostly think of it as some kind of physiological instability, perhaps hormonal imbalances. I don't know much about it, but I hope that you can bring some insights into it. What is it? And why are so many people, inflicted by that behavior?
Okay. Oh, that's a big question.
Yeah.
And one I can answer.
Good.
Well, I'll try anyway. That's it. So there's about 3 questions there. Let's just go one to one. So first of all, you brought in psychosynthesis and you brought in trauma. First of all, you said, what kind of traumas do I work with? Well, so trauma and psychosynthesis, well, we'll go with trauma and psychosynthesis. Let's start there. Okay. I've seen it written that Assagioli had not intended psychosynthesis to be a trauma therapy. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm right. I don't know. I have seen it written. I don't think that's particularly true. I actually think it is so beautifully and wonderfully aligned with what we know about trauma, what we know about how to work with trauma. Around that kind of part work, around how trauma gets split into different parts of our personality that hold it. And it is powerful, powerful work. And when we look at something like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which is the current used name, it has been lots of names, but I'll talk about that a little bit.
Yeah.
There is a real intersection between trauma and ADHD. They run parallel, they run within each other. And I'll talk first of all a little bit about what ADHD is.
Yeah.
Okay. It is a neurobiological disorder of executive functioning, which is the executive functioning part is around how the brain is able to regulate itself in order to think and to choose behavior. And it's a cognitive disorder. It used to be called a behavioral disorder, which is actually really misleading, and is to some extent, well, to a huge extent, actually reductionist, because what it does is actually looks at the outside experience. And this is also the reason that ADHD used to be called ADD, because there was a part of it that was inattentive, and that was the one without considering that was considered to not have hyperactivity. But hyperactivity and impulsivity is internalized, so it may not show in some forms of ADHD externally, but the internal turmoil and impulsivity and hyperactivity presents in many different ways, and often internal. And I'll come back to that when we start talking about how psychosynthesis works so well with this. There are three main types at the moment that are known about psychosynthesis. I keep talking about psychosynthesis. There are three main types that are known around ADHD presentation. The first one is predominantly inattentive. That's zoning out. That's the hyper focus. That's when I'll talk about those terms in a moment, because they're actually two sides of the same coin, in my opinion. And forgetfulness and what we think of as inattention, actually, it's, for me, it's around the fact that actually it's not that someone with ADHD or someone with presenting with these symptoms isn't able to focus, but they are unable to have selective attention. You know, if you think about the fact that actually we're sitting here and you're not thinking about the clothes that you're wearing, you're not sensing them, you're not sensing your shoes in your feet in your shoes and your socks and your hair maybe on your face or your glasses, you're able to tune that out. Now, the thing is around someone with ADHD is actually their brain is unable to do that. The brain is unable to filter out, and so there's so much stimuli. You know, the clicking of the clock, the flickering of the candle, the humming of the light, you know, your voice.
So it's kind of hyper awareness.
It is a huge hyper awareness, which means that actually it's really, really difficult to come to be one to bring in one pointedness, if we think about, you know, and actually developing that as a you know, if we think of qualities of will, of actually developing that is really, really powerful work.
And this. Still, you mentioned hyper focus, so there seems to be you know, hyper awareness, but they can also be hyper focused, and it seems to be a contradiction that they can be hyper focused but still aware of all these different things going on in the surrounding.
It's a really fabulous and really fabulous phenomenon of how it happens to zone into something. It's kind of zoning out and a zoning in.
Yes.
That hyper focus is actually zoning out from everything else. So, you know, someone will get kind of, it happens to everybody to some extent. You know, we might get creative, and we've become so immersed in our creativity that actually the house can be burning down, and oh my gosh, it's 6 o'clock and it's dinner time, and all these things. Or, you know, we do it when we read a book. You know, we immerse ourselves in that moment. I just want to quickly talk about the other, the three presentations that we know of.
Yes,
there are others that are out there on the internet, but they haven't had, you know, scientific validation. There's not enough research around them. So the three that I said is ADHD predominantly inattentive, ADHD predominantly hyperactive. Actually, that's the rarest in adults. It is at the moment, because there's not enough research around kind of presentation in girls. It's a lot happening now, but that was the one that was often seen in classrooms. That was why boys were getting more attention around this and more kind of maybe going for diagnosis because of the hyperactivity. That's actually the rarest in adults. It lessens over time, and there's lots of potential reasons why. And then there's the combined type, which is actually the most I believe that's the most prevalent research is telling us at the moment. So
Yeah.
I can talk more, but let's see where you are. What
I was thinking about is some of the language around it. You know, the brain is not able to zoom in, and then I think about the psychosynthesis context. Is it the brain that thinks? You know, it's the whole problem of, because it can sound very reductionist, you know, that if everything is just a biological condition, then the solution must be medication. If it's only biological, but I think there must be some kind of connection between body and mind. There must be something that is you know, the origin of this problem. There must be some of it that is related to psychology, and perhaps some of it that is related to biology. Are there any clarification between these two?
I don't think it's just the two. I don't think it's just the two. I think there's so much more to this story that is still unfolding.
Yeah.
You know,
could you enlarge on that?
Yeah. I sure will. Yes, I mean, so there has been a recent backlash a backlash in recent years about the theory of ADHD stemming from trauma. Because that is too narrow-minded. It really is reducing down the what we know about it. It's becoming too narrow-minded. There's just not enough evidence around that to support that trauma causes ADHD. Okay. We know that trauma will exasperate, make worse any symptoms that were there, any underlying propensity towards ADHD.
Yeah.
You know, but does it cause it? Research is showing that it does not. Now, we are still, you know, I love this phrase, we're in this phase of becoming. And if we can hold the sense of, it's not, you know, Assagioli talks about this, you know, the moment we go to, you know, this certainty, we cut out on the fact of the fact that actually something else is seeking to emerge, you know, and research is evolving. And I'm so grateful to see that it's really coming to the fore around all aspects of human experience. And I'll talk about, you know, what that means actually in just a moment, but I'll just come back to what you were saying about biology and psychology and neurobiology and psychology. We know that our brains are, you know, neuroplasticity knows that says that our brains are evolving all the time. And that doesn't just happen, I believe, you know, from the moment that we are born. We have been evolving through the beginning of time. Unfortunately, there's not enough research and evidence to really start to unpack what that could mean of, you know, the origins of ADHD. You know, I do a lot of work around in Britain. We had workhouses in the 1800s, you know, and in that there may have been a reason that actually, you know, to dissociate was a way of survival. We know that. And then what happens to the brain? How does it change? How does it adapt to really facilitate that survival? And then it becomes integral. You know, we just don't know enough at the moment about the origins. I think we can actually get hung up too much on the origins. We don't really need to really focus on those in order to work with it. In some ways, it can pull us away.
Is it not a new type of complex behavior I didn't hear anything about ADHD when I was growing up. So it seems to be some kind of a recent development. And I thought about, could it also be the impact of social media? You know, there's a lot of research going into the impact of the smartphones, especially for young girls. That they are hugely impacted by all this information and the online bullying that's going on, the comparison, between girls, that the mental health crisis among the youth is really is spiking after the smartphones. And I thought, is there any link, by being on the phone and changing awareness all the time, then you have to deal with this, then you have to deal with that. For me, it's overwhelming sometimes to be online, because I'm a very sensitive person. So I have to be very disciplined about the use of online media, because it's influencing me and creating stress. If I'm not vigilant about, I'm not on Twitter. I've tried to be on Twitter, but I cannot be on Twitter because there's so much conflict all the time. And I'm thinking about that type of influence on young people who are growing up with these impacts.
So the first question you asked, first of all, is it a new phenomenon? Phenomenon.
Yeah.
Actually, a study has just come out, not a study, but a paper acknowledging that ADHD-like symptoms were documented in 1753.
Okay.
1753 by a Dutch physician who wrote about it in a medical book. A paper has just come out in the Lancet, I believe, that describes a physician, and I can't remember his name at the moment, but I can find it for you, who from the Netherlands, who wrote about ADHD-like symptoms in a medical book. It was written in Latin, so it's taken a while to have it translated. But before that, up until in 2012, it was seen that there was another paper that came out by someone called Russell Barkley, PhD, who does a lot of work around ADHD, and he identified that it had been described, again, ADHD-like symptoms in children and adults, I believe, in 1770, and that was in Germany. So often we think about it as being an American discovery, but actually it was about 30 years before actually it was documented by British and American medical professionals. So so it's been around a long time. Our culture is really set up in order to steal our attention, actually. So anything, if you think about how life was 50 years ago, our worlds were so much smaller.
Exactly.
Our communities were simpler and closer, and we could shut the door and the world would be outside. We would go to bed when it got dark, And so actually our attention span is being stretched and pulled in many ways. And you talked about social media. And as you were talking about, you said, I can't be on Twitter, and I call it X now, and I call it Twitter, but because I'm not on it either. And you say, I can't be on it because I'm sensitive. And I wondered, it made me wonder about, I wonder how you found out that actually it was too much. Because so many people don't have the ability to really tune into that too muchness and then to choose. Social media platforms, everything around social media apps and everything is all designed to steal I believe, to steal from us. Attention, energy, focus, money, time, all of these things.
So do you think there is some kind of correlation between these symptoms and social media?
I believe that as humans, it's increasingly difficult to come back to oneself in order to filter out what needs to be filtered out and to really tune into what's really important.
Yeah.
Whether that is getting children ready for school on time, or getting to work, or doing a job, all of these things, or connecting with your partner.
Exactly.
I don't believe that social media and the digital age is responsible for the rise in ADHD, but I do believe it's responsible for the inability for regulation to be really fostered at a young age, to be developed in order to create an environment where one can connect with what they need to be connecting with, and to find that stillness that we talked about earlier.
If these people have hyper awareness, if that's part of the the etiology of their problem, then being exposed to social media, I can tell you how I meditate every morning 1 hour, and it's an awareness-based meditation. So I know what's popping up in my mind because I'm studying my mind stream. And if content from Twitter or Facebook starts to emerge in my consciousness, voices or stuff from the online world, then I know that I have to be vigilant in disidentifying from it and start limiting the time that I'm exposed to these impressions. Because everything that we view will be impressed on the subconscious, but not in an equal way, because we are wired up to be impressed by some content more than others, depending on our background. So I just think if these people with this type of disorder, they are hyper aware, then they must also be more sensitive to this invading type of energy that comes from, and it's so intelligent designed that that the content that you are paying attention to, it gets reinforced, by the algorithm. So we get more and more of what we are attached to, and this again creates a bigger and bigger impact on the subconscious.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
So I'm not claiming that it's the cause of it, but I just see that people with that type of vulnerability should pay really close attention to how they are using social media.
And what if they don't know how? How do they go ahead? How do they begin to pay attention to how they're using social media?
Yeah.
The tools aren't there.
And
We talked about trauma just a moment ago, and I just want to come back to that, because what we talked about, you said about the vulnerabilities and sensitivities. This is a huge, huge area of how trauma and ADHD collide. How trauma actually, traumatized people re-traumatize. They've become back into that space of the known, the familiar, and the intensity. With people with ADHD, whether they're diagnosed, undiagnosed, or that actually what the symptoms they're experiencing are trauma related. And I don't think we can really separate the two, because they're constantly together. ADHD and trauma, I mean. What you talked about there around the fact of being vulnerable, it is a known fact that people who are neurodivergent are more at risk to being manipulated, to being to abuse, to
Could you
experience.
define that concept, neurodivergent? What's that?
Yeah, it's not neurodivergent. It's one of these evolving terms that I'll be really interested to see where we go to next in the next 10, 15 years about how it's described. Neurodivergent is really what we're talking about is particular, and this is an area that I'm not particularly an expert in, as kind of naming each one, but it's around the neurodevelopment of the brain. So things like autism spectrum disorder.
Okay.
Yeah. We're thinking about maybe trauma related. If we look at borderline personality disorder, obviously that has roots in trauma, of course, as well. There's a real intersection there. And, again, that is really highlighted around, what is, how it presents and how it ends up being, the person is very, very vulnerable to manipulation, to risk taking, to not being able to regulate. So there's a real disruption in regulation, and we'll come back to that. Actually, the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, in its 5th edition at the moment. That's actually one of the reasons that there is more, perhaps more availability and agency to seek diagnosis, is because the criteria is understood to be, it's very, very rigid at the moment. It doesn't actually mention emotional dysregulation in the DSM-5 criteria for ADHD, but that's a huge element of it, of the condition itself. And so it'd be really interesting to see how that's coming out in assessments. I believe that is really also being part of the assessment process now, of really exploring that. So I don't know if I've answered your question so much about what neurodivergence is in a kind of a technical term, but really it's the brain's inability to be able to choose. There are developmental delays in regulation, in forward planning. About 30% is, there's a developmental delay. So by the time I think someone is 20 or even actually, I think it's 12, they can look 2 weeks ahead. When you're 20, you can look 3 months ahead, that type of thing. With someone with ADHD or neurodivergence or neurodiversity, whatever you want to call it, that is extremely reduced. I mean, hugely reduced, actually. So really, when you're looking at someone who's maybe 10 or 11, 12, without neurodivergence, without ADHD as a neurodivergence, they would be able to look maybe 2-3 weeks ahead. Someone who's got that would only be able to look a few days or a day or maybe some hours. And that gap doesn't lessen as they get older, unfortunately.
No. So from a psychosynthesis point of view, it sounds like some kind of disruption of the will, the faculty, the psychological function of the will. We would, as a psychosynthesis, we would say it's not the brain that chooses, it's the will that chooses, because we differentiate between the brain or the body and the will. They are two different faculties. But of course, all the psychological functions work through the brain. But there is a difference there, because we can develop the will if we do an effort.
But that's, hold on, let me just answer that point, because that is why this is an area, I love this area, because this is, when I'm talking with my clients, one of the ways is actually really bringing neuroscience in very, very simple kind of accessible terms, not downplaying and being patronizing, but really being able to create a mental image around what this looks like. So when we talk about that the disruption to the will. What we're talking about is the amygdala. And the amygdala, of course, it has, with ADHD, it can suffer a hijack, what they call an amygdala hijack. And when I'm and I'll talk about how psychosynthesis comes in, because it's so important and so key. And I truly believe that psychosynthesis offers something to working with people with ADHD, whether it's suspected, whether it's trauma, that is incredibly powerful. So can I just talk to you a little, tell you about what I do? So when we're starting to talk about this, I say, and I use this hand, which is often, Peter Levine talks a lot about flipping the lid. Now, I talk about that actually the amygdala can't tell the difference between a dinosaur and a car door. That moment of, and that is how someone with ADHD can get caught in an amygdala hijack. Now, what I say to my clients is that we don't know, and that would have served you, that actually that still serves you, that when you step out into the road, suddenly your brain doesn't have a time to go, oh, there's a car coming. Your body takes you out of the road really quickly. That reaction, can be really, really important. But we're not responsible, and we're not responsible for that first instinct. We're responsible for the next thing we do.
Yes.
And that's where this prefrontal cortex, the median prefrontal cortex, if you want to be precise. And obviously, I'm simplifying this. I call that the gatekeeper. And I talk to my clients about the fact that actually with someone, so that part of our brains, I think this is fascinating. It does not develop fully until we are around 30. Now, someone who has experienced trauma and maybe even suffering from PTSD, someone who has experienced trauma as a child, someone who has ADHD or any other neurodevelopmental conditions, that will be delayed even further. Now, where psychosynthesis comes in is that I talk about with my clients is that we can become collaborators in this process. The person themselves can become a collaborator in that process, because as soon as we pause to go, how am I feeling in this moment? To name those feelings, literally to name them, to go, oh, I'm feeling, and to kind of name that. What we're doing is a number of different things. We're creating the pause, which brings, of course, choice. But while we're naming, we're actually having to break out of that hijack, which is, again, creating that spaciousness to name it. It's hard to do to begin with. But as we do that, we become collaborators in helping to develop that prefrontal cortex.
Yes.
It can be incredibly empowering to go, oh, it's okay. It's a car door, not a dinosaur, And I know I've kind of downplayed that, but here we're talking about will that can be found within the pause, the power of the pause, And Asa Jolie often talks about we only need a morsel of it, because it builds more will builds more will. And so that moment is, even if it's just a tiny, even pinprick of pause to go, that is something that can really be developed. And that's where psychosynthesis comes in.
And if we could go out of that lane, and speak more about when you encounter persons with ADHD, how do you contextualize it? How do you work with them? What's the first step? Are there anything, if the people that are viewing this episode wonder, if I come to you, what type of intervention or help can you offer from a psychosynthesis point of view?
Good question. Well, first, we've been to, as we pause on the whole neuroscience element of it. David Nowell is a PhD. He said and I'm going to quote this, ADHD is the intersection between neurology and spirituality.
Okay.
It is the nexus between science and meaning making. And this is where I meet my clients in the room. And I purposely don't call them patients.
No.
Because of it is a very collaborative process. And we can pathologize, and then we lose the client, we lose the person, we lose the self that's in the room.
Yeah.
So I work a lot with this in this area, and there is to some extent a format, you know, in terms of grounding and resourcing. You know, we talk about that actually we need to really create, you know, help to build the container. And we start right from the very beginning of building the container of the room. I very rarely self-disclose personally, very, very, very rarely, and only after real consideration and some time. But
what do you mean by self-disclose?
Talk about my own story. So that personal self-disclosure about my own story, which actually can create bias, unconscious bias. It invites it into the room almost, because suddenly then my questions become very, you know, tailored and pointed, and then maybe I become identified, and then I'm unable to really see the person in front of me, caught in that very powerful, those transferential energies. So if we think about psychosynthesis, when a client comes to me, I do tend to some extent, really self-disclose about the process of therapy. And that is helping to create the container. I keep the mystery because, of course, that is also something that is needed in that space. But I talk about, you know, here are the walls. This is what therapy looks like. This is how we work. I often, actually, I really help to ground the client by, we talk about time, that actually that the 10 minutes at the end, we're going to start to wind down and we'll start to come back into the room. Then they actually are, by me doing that, they're invited into this process of really becoming conscious to the fact of, I feel really overwhelmed. I'm glad that the session isn't finishing yet. Now we need to really ground on what that would look like so that I can step into the world. You know, so right from the very, very start, we bring awareness and will and love and compassion into the room. And for me, psychosynthesis works really well in this, because there are so many models that work with parts and archetypes, but it's the real unique individual emergence of this person's personal relationship to the parts that have kept them safe through the and we have, you know, part of our work is finding self in the sub personality, you know, listening for the no, and really giving a seat to resistance in the room. Resistance has to have a space in the room to help us to find our no. So do you want to hear about psychosynthesis?
I think I would like to boil it down to some principles, you know, and if I hear that you work with the pause and you work with, you know, observing what's going on inside the client. And of course, helping the client to be more aware of all the impulses, you know, all the impacts that comes in, and it can come in internally from trauma or from psychological formations, but it can also come from the surrounding environment, family, and society in general. So I see, just to understand it, that strengthening that center of awareness, and also bringing in, you know, the ability to choose where to bring attention could be very helpful in this situation. So, and this is how I understand a container. You know, being a container for what's going on is you have to have a center that contains whatever is going on. And finding that center is calming, relaxing, it's stabilizing, because you know who you are. When you are caught in the mind stream and impulses that just overwhelms you, then of course you just get triggered by everything, and there's no captain on the boat. So it looks like, is that correct, understood? It looks like you are working by strengthening awareness and will, and gradually helping people understand what's impacting them in the moment.
Yes, and we do it and I do that work at every single level. It's a multi-layered, multifaceted, multi-leveled experience, because as we are talking about creating space in the room, what we're actually doing is talking about building the container of self to continue and hold self, to build the ego strength, and that ego strength, meaning we need to have the container, we need to have an ego in order to hold ourselves in the world. And I'm very open around the ways that we can think of ego out. The ego has a lot of people use the word and have different meanings for it. So we talk about it as we're building the container, the vessel. You said a boat, we have to get to know, we build the vessel in order to travel. And that's in the therapeutic terms, but also what I'm talking about I'm connecting to self and speaking to the deep unconscious when we're talking about creating that container. Because invariably, we can't do any work until that's built. And that's very powerful in those early stages of therapy. I'll talk about as well some of the other things that we do around further on in the therapy with psychosynthesis, where it really comes into play. And I often talk about, we need to get to know the landscape of the person before we can travel.
Exactly.
And there's a real risk, of course, working with anything when there's chaos in the room, when there's a lot of energy in the room, for the therapist or the coach or the educator to be caught in that, to get it's syntopic counter-transferences, where we get that experience of what the client's life is like. We feel the feelings, it's like that they feel. It can feel incredibly overwhelming, incredibly overstimulating. And there is a risk of whoever's working with this person to try and close it down. Okay, let me ground you. It's like, can we actually be with this messiness? And we be with we're getting to know that this person is communicating, and it does change. It's not always like that, but in the first at least good number of sessions, there's like a spatial orientation that the client will do with their energy is going over. They're just feeling the walls. And if we as practitioners can really tune into ourselves, and then to really connect with our I, and to, go, oh yeah, I'm being triggered by this. Okay, now what? Actually what we're doing is energetically, we are modeling, we're co-regulating.
Yeah, exactly.
We don't need to, it doesn't need to come out of our words. It doesn't need to be models. There is tune into self, hold that ground, find that ground within ourselves, and be with the ability to be with whatever is emerging. And it's just such a gift to work in that way with the client, for them and for ourselves too.
Yeah, definitely. And, it's such a huge topic, and I think it could be very helpful if you did an exercise from your practice, so we could have some kind of experience of how you work with a client which have these type of problems. Do you have anything you would like to offer at this moment? And I could be your guinea pig. And
Okay. I do. There's lots of ways of working with this. Just one thing I would say is that when there is a potential for ADHD to be in the room, just as there is a potential for trauma to be in the room, it's difficult to work out which is which. It's okay. But what we do know from recent studies is that mindfulness-based activities, meditation, can be helpful. However, it's very important to check in is, really, really assess if that's the right intervention, because actually it can be destabilizing too. It can go to dissociation. So that's the same with trauma as it is with ADHD. That's how they collide. But there is one exercise that can be really helpful, especially further on in the therapy. It can often be the very first exercise that I do. So
Yes.
meditation exercise. So we'll do that.
Yes, sounds awesome.
Okay, so just get yourself comfortable, and it's really important to just remember that, check out with yourself first of all whether you want to lower your eyes to the ground or whether it feels more comfortable to close them, and maybe try both just to see what feels good enough for now. And there is no right or wrong way to do this. The only right or wrong way to do this is that feeling of, oh no, that doesn't feel good for me. Oh no, that's better. And that's where we start. And from that place, just allow a couple of nice deep breaths in and out. And if your attention finds that it wanders away, we're just going to come back to that in and out. The rise of the shoulders with the in-breath and the dropping into the seat of the out-breath. And allow your breath to find its own gentle rhythm, not changing or forcing, but just noticing that it takes its time. To come to a place that feels calm. You might notice your heart beating. Not changing, just noticing. Now, if you will, remember what it was like for you getting up this morning. And if you can, just picture yourself waking up, how you felt in your body, what feelings you might have been with this morning, maybe throughout the morning, making your breakfast, getting ready for this morning, and just watch yourself, watch what happened for you this morning, that outer experience of getting ready, and the inner experience of what it was like for you. And just follow yourself through the activities and the things that you did to bring yourself here, getting ready to leave the house. Maybe if you were driving, just watch your journey, just almost like a bird's eye view, just observe yourself. What worries you might have been with. What things you were planning, what was on your mind. And then just follow yourself coming to this session. Or whatever journey you took, just be with yourself in that journey. Notice what it was like if you were driving or if you were just preparing for this space. Notice yourself coming into this space then, watching yourself walking in and sitting down, getting everything ready, and whatever it was that you needed to do, just watching that experience. And as we've been talking, just notice what it was like for you. this last however long it's been. Just watching yourself, watching your experience, that outer experience, what you were doing and speaking, and the inner experience of what was resonating, the intensity or the speed of your thoughts, the little impulses, concerns. And anything else. Now, imagine what it was like for you beginning the invitation to start this exercise. And the beginning of it. And noticing now your experience as you've moved through this exercise. Notice how your body is feeling in this moment. Not changing or judging anything, but just noticing. Are there any areas of tension in your body that you're noticing? And if there are, breathe into them. And what that means is to breathe in. And as you breathe out, allowing the energy to flow out of you that no longer serves. And remembering that actually when we breathe out, really what's being retained and brought into our bodies is the oxygen that replenishes and nurtures and nourishes every fiber of our being, our physical being, our vehicle in the world, the thing that holds us. Notice how you feel now in your body that's different from how you may have felt this morning. Notice what feelings and emotions you may be with now. Are they different? Or have they changed in some way? Softened? Or something else? Just notice what you're with. Finding your own space and your own way of connecting with what is now. And the same around your thoughts. How's your mind feeling? This incredible mind that helps to make meaning of things. Not getting too engaged, but just noticing them from a distance. How's the intensity? The speed of those thoughts? Remembering there's no right way or wrong way, it's just noticing. And then letting go of attention to those thoughts, really notice the you that is noticing. Notice the quality of that part within you where you are most essentially you. And connect with that just for a moment. Holding it if you can, being there if you will. And notice what this is like for you. How different it is. from other experiences of yourself. And then when you're ready, and only very slowly, begin to just move back into the awareness of the outside room, the sounds around you. Not coming back too quickly, just noticing the outside experience of you. Feet on the floor, your body in the chair. And when you're ready, and only in your own time, begin to bring yourself back. And when you open your eyes, just look around the room a little bit. Notice the walls.
Yeah.
Mm.
Well, this definitely prepares me for counseling. It brings me from the past to the present, and noticing tensions and stiffness in the neck, and just waking up to the reality of being me right here and now, or the reality that is close to my awareness. And I really think this type of exercise is so crucial and essential to psychosynthesis, because we find a center from where we can start investigating what's in my body, what's in my emotional nature, what's in my mind, and very often, if we are not centered, we tend to start on the surface instead of diving a little bit lower, or coming a little bit more into the center, and from there we can go more directly to the suffering or the pain or what we would like to investigate. So I think it was a very helpful exercise, and especially for people that are not used to meditate. I think it was a very, very gentle exercise where you guide me from my external environment, sitting in the car, or waking up, sitting in the car, and now entering here, and then into the inner dimension. So I believe in it.
You can hear it in your voice. Yes.
Yeah, it has a calming effect.
Yeah, there you go.
It has a calming effect.
It does. Yeah, and obviously it changes depending on. It's very unique. Obviously, I've showed you what it was like when I work with someone who hasn't meditated before. Really, that spaciousness can feel very, very overwhelming. So to give much silence, and that can actually, as we work with that window of tolerance, dance to the edge and come back. Actually that spaciousness increases.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And the spaciousness is, for me, the awareness of the self. And I think it's very important to say that for me, meditation is not necessarily about, being calm, but the first step is to be aware of what's going on. And sometimes when we meditate, we wake up to the tensions and the suffering, and it's overwhelming. But as long as we are aware of it, and we take our identity in the awareness part, then we can start love, then we can start accepting, then we can start embracing what is present. And I think that's really a crucial point to teach people. So meditation is not for me. Of course, the long-term effect of meditation can be that we become more calm and gentle if we meditate on that. But for me, meditation is more revelatory. It's some kind of a light that we start opening up to, and that light will just show us what's in our house, and from there we can start the cleaning or
Yes,
reorganizing.
the containing, the kind of the moving. Oh, this no longer serves here, but it's it restricts here, but it serves brilliantly here.
Yeah,
That's a whole nother conversation about subpersonalities, which is
yeah,
maybe for another time. But
exactly.
yeah.
But thank you, Karen. It has been a great experience for me, and I'm sure that people who listen and view this will find a lot of food for thought and a lot of important things to ponder on. And of course, we cannot, come all around such an important topic. But I think we took a first step, and if people want to know more about you and your work, where can they connect with you?
Yeah, they can connect with me via my website, which is www.karenrawdon.com.
Yes.
I'm also available on the Psychosynthesis Trust has a practitioner website, so does the Institute, all the other kind of practitioner listings around there, and drop me a message to continue this conversation. It's a big conversation, and I think it's very wonderful to where we can start where we are.
Yeah.
And I think
I will add all your details in the description of this video, so people can just look there and connect with you. And yeah, thank you for your presence and your time and all the work you're doing. So thank you
so much. Take good care.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to Psychosynthesis Conversations. Please don't forget to like and subscribe and help us to spread the wisdom.